paper and the discussion sheet are on Blackboard, right? Okay, so that's what you're gonna be asked on the test, is what's on the discussion sheet. So, gonna be going over two papers today. One of these is very closely related to, mobile systems. Again, gonna have to be careful about going into networking stuff in this class, just because networking is not a prerequisite. However, hopefully at this point, for you folks that are taking networking, you've at least been exposed to some of the things in TCP, specifically things like congestion control. Okay, so we're gonna talk about that a little bit today when we talk about RUDP. And then we're gonna talk about a paper that's a little bit more closely related to, pervasive systems. But it's also kind of begin to work its way into pretty much every aspect of connected life, right? Which is called gamification. Okay, so we're talking about these two papers today, and then I brought my access point and everything else so you guys can work on your labs when you're done. Now, the thing with RUDP, this paper was put together by mostly folks at the Air Force Research Laboratory as well as folks at Lockheed Martin. And so, what this paper is about, it's about airborne networks. Okay? Because airborne networks have some interesting aspects about them that kind of frustrate the way that we use a lot of protocols that we typically have on the internet. They don't work very well on airborne networks. Okay, when we send data through the air over very long ranges, okay, the issue is it has low data throughput. Okay? Typically, we have very high packet loss, right? It's the air, it's not guided media. And so when we send things through the air, we're gonna have a lot of things interfering with that propagation. And so we're just gonna lose stuff periodically. Okay, so because we have very high packet loss, we're gonna have a high error rate. When we have a high error rate, typically what we have to do is that we have to go back and just resend stuff that got screwed up because we don't necessarily have a fancy way of fixing it, okay? Periodically, we can have stuff delivered out of order, all kinds of issues. So the trouble is, if we just try to use two of the biggest transport protocols that we have on the internet right now, TCP and UDP, both of those don't really work very well over this sort of medium. Okay? TCP, we'll talk about TCP here in just a second. When we talk about UDP, UDP is called best effort, which means what? What's best effort mean?
It's not reliable.
Yeah, not
Not
reliable.
in order transmission.
When we say best effort, what we mean is an effort. Like it tries once. If it works, that's awesome, and if not, oh well. Okay, so when we are trying to use that over something where we know for a fact we're gonna have high packet loss, well, that's not gonna work. But the trouble is, trying to use TCP in that kind of environment really doesn't work very well either. Okay, so RUDP attempts to have some kind of quality of service, okay, in that particular environment. So RUDP is reliable using datagram protocol. We're going to have some trade-offs between reliability and latency, but hopefully it's going to work okay over airborne networks. And say quality of service, what are we talking about? It's quality of service. Quality of service is anything you can guarantee about how that protocol is going to behave. Things like guaranteed delivery, we're going to make sure it gets there. Guaranteed throughput, how much data are we going to be able to push down a network, okay? So anything we can talk about with regards to latency, okay, any of that kind of stuff, all of that's quality of service. UDP doesn't offer anything, okay? Again, it's just best effort. Okay. So we want to have some kind of instance where we have UDP, we're making use of very high throughput of UDP, but we're not really suffering any of the effects of TCP. Okay? Now, to talk about TCP, you guys may have seen this, okay? So when you talk about networking, that's a queue. Okay? So if we have the emission rate and the transmission rate in that queue, we have this nice little one-to-one kind of correspondence here. Okay, so that queue just kind of fills up and then it empties, right? Have you guys seen this in your networking class? Yeah, probably. So what happens on the internet is because we have a lot of different data flows that are sharing that particular medium, so that when that emission rate really, really cranks up, that queue fills up super quickly. Okay? And it fills up really, really quickly, and then what happens is, okay, it starts dropping packets. We start seeing a lot of things coming out the bottom. So the thing is, even if we speed all the way back down, or slow all the way back down, look how long it takes for that queue to actually empty. that transmission rate's not gonna speed up, it's gonna stay where it is. If that emission rate kicks back up again, well, here comes all your data, that's just gonna fill right up again, and you're gonna start dropping numbers. Okay, you guys have probably seen this at some point. So, that is a model of how TCP handles congestion. Okay, when TCP loses something, it assumes that it has lost it due to congestion. Okay, so it assumes it lost it because that queue has filled all the way up and it's dropping stuff. Right, so TCP backs all the way off, almost all the way off, not quite all the way off, but it backs way, way off. Right, and it backs way, way off very, very aggressively so that it makes sure that this queue actually empties. Okay. The trouble is when we start going over airborne networks, well, now we're losing stuff, right? But we're not losing stuff due to congestion anymore. We're losing stuff because it's the air, and the air just kind of screws stuff up. So if we're just running TCP over this particular network, TCP is going to assume that when it loses something, it lost it due to congestion, and it's gonna back way, way off. But again, we're not losing it due to congestion, we're losing it because it's the air. Okay, so TCP is really not gonna have any kind of throughput in that sort of environment. But the trouble is, if we're just using UDP, UDP's best effort. So if anything gets screwed up, we can try and retransmit it or anything. So what our UDP is attempting to do is it's attempting to take the best of both worlds. Right? We're gonna take the reliability out of TCP along with some of the light overhead that we have with UDP. We're gonna put those together in an attempt to get something that's gonna work over the air. Okay? So, borrows a number of concepts from TCP. Okay? So we definitely have things like acknowledgements, okay? We have sequence numbers, we have a number of different timers, so forth and so on, okay? In TCP, okay, we typically have what are called acknowledgements, right? So you have acknowledgements and negative acknowledgements. What's a negative acknowledgement? TCP, what's a NAC? Or does TCP even have NACs? NAC is a negative acknowledgement, right? So the explicit notification that you lost something, that's what a NAC is. A TCP actually doesn't use NACs, it has implicit notifications, okay? So what happens when you send an acknowledgement to TCP, what you're saying is, you're saying what the next segment number you are expecting to see in that flow is. So when you say what you're expecting to see, you are implicitly saying what you just got. Okay? RUDP has something real similar to that. So when it sends an acknowledgement, what you're saying is you are saying what you got, not necessarily what you expect to receive. Not a big deal, just kind of something if you're gonna look into this deeply, you need to understand that. Okay? Now, RUDP does use basically negative acknowledgements, or what it calls extended acknowledgements. Okay? So, you send that when you get stuff that is out of sequence. Okay? And when we say out of sequence, what does that mean?
You get byte 2, you go to byte 1.
Right, exactly. And so what happened to byte 1? Here's a big trick. On the internet, stuff can actually get lost and end up finding its way to the endpoints. Okay? Because in packet switch networks, what happened is you're not guaranteed to take the same path through a packet switch network every single time you send something. You can take a different route every time. So it's possible to have stuff received out of order that still actually ends up getting to you, just because we don't have that route picked out ahead of time, right? If you had circuit switch networks, okay, or virtual circuit networks rather, okay, you would take the same path. With packet switching, you don't have that. Okay, so it's possible to receive something out of order with TCP and still end up getting it anyway. That's not what's happening here. When you have something received out of sequence, well, the error didn't just lose it. Okay, that means it screwed up, it's dropped. So it's not gonna wind up coming to you at some other time. Okay, slight difference between what's happening here and what's actually happening with TCP. Okay, now, something here. Any unacknowledged packet will be retransmitted by the sender until a certain number of retransmission attempts is reached, in which case the packet will be considered stale and it's going to be dropped. Does TCP do that? Does TCP have an upper bound on the number of times it tries to retransmit a packet per second? And it doesn't. TCP will continue to retransmit that until that socket connection is closed. RUDP is different. our UDP has a definitive upper bound here. And if it hits that upper bound in terms of retransmission attempts, it just tries, it doesn't try anymore, it just stops. Okay, now if this is the Air Force, why might it do that? Why would we say that data's just stale? Okay, it's too old to be of any kind of use, so we're just not gonna send it. Why might the Air Force be doing something like that? Well, if we're talking about, maybe radar data, right? You have an AWACS platform, therefore, radio control platform. Okay, if we're tracking jets that are moving 700 miles an hour, is it really that useful to know where the jet was 3 seconds ago? Because it's not there anymore. Right? So if you were trying to send that kind of data, when the Air Force is gonna say, this is too old, it's not useful. So screw it, just drop it. So it's not network. What do we call that? When something is just too old to be useful. Then we call that delay loss, right? So if we have conversational multimedia, we kind of mentioned that, that's delay loss. Okay, so just because we get something doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to use it anyway. Something else that our UDP does, okay, is that when it gets something that is received out of order, okay, it places that in a receiving buffer. Okay, so it places something in a receiving buffer if it gets received out of order. Does TCP do that? No. TCP just assumes you're gonna retransmit. Okay. So with our UDP, it does keep it. And the reason it does keep it is, again, this is just a lossy medium, so we don't wanna have to retransmit things if we don't have to. Okay, so we can keep what we actually did get and then reassemble it later. Much better option than with TCP, because with TCP, well, you got plenty of throughput there. It's kind of something to kind of keep in mind here. Something else that happens, the receiver is going to remove packets from the receiving buffer as soon as it receives the missing packets. Okay. Does TCP immediately take things out of that receiving buffer? Can something be received and still be dropped in TCP? Yeah, it can. We call that flow control. In TCP, that's what's called flow control. So the thing is, if the application is busy doing something and the application cannot consume that data immediately, okay, it needs to be buffered until the application can actually consume it. And so what happens in TCP is that you can have data transit the network all the way and be arriving at the targeted end system and end up being dropped anyways because that receive buffer is being overflown. Okay, overflown? Whatever, it's being filled up and you're dropping it. Okay, not the case with our UDP. When you get stuff in our UDP, we take it out immediately. Okay, another minor difference there. Now, things with our UDP, okay, we have a sending window here. Have something real similar in TCP too, okay? So when we have a sending window in TCP, what is that in TCP? Why do we have a sending window in TCP? Basically, sending window, TCP is what's called a pipeline protocol. Okay? That means that we have multiple packets, multiple segments, rather, since this is a transport layer protocol, we have multiple segments in transit before we have acknowledgement. And the sending window is just placing an upper bound on the number of segments that we can have before they are acknowledged. Okay, so our UDP has that as well. Okay, we have what's called max cumulative acknowledgements. Okay, so what is happening here is that with our UDP, okay, it is acknowledging that you are receiving multiple packets with just one acknowledgement rather than acknowledging each individual thing that you send. TCP has something relatively similar, okay? TCP has what's called cumulative acknowledgements. Okay? This is what's called max cumulative acknowledgements. So whereas TCP is still going to acknowledge each segment that you get, our UDP, we're actually going to accumulate that into a minimum number of acknowledgements. Similar concept, just a minor difference. Okay, let's see. Again, we have this whole thing about max rate transmission count, okay? So just because we can get something to that other platform, if we don't get it soon enough, it's not useful to us, so just stop trying. have what is called a null segment. What a null segment is, it is a keep alive mechanism, okay? So with TCP, typically when you want to close a socket, okay, what's gonna happen is you have to go through, it's actually kind of an elaborate process to close the individual socket down so that everybody's on the same page with regards to you're not gonna be receiving data anymore. RUDP doesn't do that. RUDP needs to explicitly be kept alive, right? So you send those null segments to explicitly get them going. Then you have what's called max out of order sequence. Okay, so when too many out of order packets arrive at the receiver, basically what you're gonna do here is that you're going to immediately send one of these enhanced acknowledgements, okay, rather than sending a cumulative acknowledgement. So what's happening here is that you are getting a lot of stuff out of sequence. Well, again, if you are going to deliver that packet in time, you've got to go and get what was lost immediately. Okay, so instead of waiting and for the sender to implicitly infer that you have actually lost something, you're just gonna go ahead and send one of these immediately. Okay, TCP has something real similar to this, right? That's a 3 duplicate packet rule, which I forget the formal name of, but it's doing something similar. Okay. A couple of different variations on RUDP. We have what's called enhanced RUDP. So it adds a couple of things to what you could consider standard RUDP, which is what they described above. Okay. Data packet aging. What is happening here? It is specifying the maximum amount of delay that an application can tolerate. Okay. Again, if we are sending something like radar data through the air, it doesn't necessarily make any sense to deliver something that's a couple of seconds old. Right? If you have something flying at extremely high speeds, where it was a couple of seconds ago is not where it is now, which is not where it's gonna be. So it's not useful. Okay. So if we can reduce the amount of delay that we can tolerate, we can reduce the number of times that we may have to retransmit something. So we put that data packet aging. If it is too old, don't bother sending it, just give up. Now, the trick is, there really isn't any kind of fancy way of doing this, okay? Because the application itself, well, how much delay it can tolerate is totally subjective, okay? So basically what happens is that you're gonna have an operator sitting there and looking at that console, and depending on the circumstances of what's happening, they're gonna have to say, okay, well, this is just going too slow, it's not useful for us, right? So we gotta have human intervention there. That's subjective. We don't have any kind of fancy formula for it. It's just subjective. Okay. Dynamic retransmission control. Okay. Basically what's happening here, this is reliable-ish. Okay. It's not necessarily just best effort, right? Because what best effort is, best effort tries, and then if it doesn't work, it just gives up. It's like, whatever, dude, it's your problem. The thing is, this will try, but it's not gonna guarantee something's gonna get there. Okay, we have a maximum number of times we're gonna retransmit something, then we're just gonna give up and move on. Okay, if we can't retransmit something within a certain window of time, we're just gonna give up and move on. So it's not 100% reliable, because we will give up eventually. Okay, however, it's not necessarily best effort, because best effort implies that you don't try again at all. So there's not real, dynamic retransmission control is saying it's reliable again-ish, right? There's no real fancy terminology for that. Okay. Now, something kind of interesting with the simulation here. So they simulated this with OpNet, which is open source. I think they have OpNet++ out there now. You guys can actually download that and use it. Though I strongly recommend you don't, because it's garbage. What's happening here? They have this whole thing set up, right? So, these larger nodes, these would result in, so you represent something like an AWACS platform, okay? So the way that they set these up, these were basically routers. And you would have routers that were connected together, and then these individual nodes, okay, those would represent end systems that you're trying to get into. So what happened is, all of these nodes in that simulation were actually static. They weren't moving around, okay? What was moving around was your destination. Your destination was kind of moving back and forth. Particular scenario. Okay. Now, I thought that was kind of an interesting design decision, right? In the real world, aircraft aren't stationary. right? They don't fly very well when that's the case. However, are we concerned about how they're moving, or are we concerned about how they're moving relative to each other? Right? Because, for instance, aircraft can fly in formation. Right? When you're flying in formation, are you moving relative to one another? You guys know what flying in formation means, right? Yeah, so when you're flying in formation, you're not moving relative to one another. You're moving in absolute terms because you're going through the air, right? But relative to one another, you're in the same place. So what they did here was they're saying, okay, well, all of these nodes, they're static, right? But in practice, if they were flying in formation, they would be static relative to one another. So it's a relative thing. Interesting design. I don't know if that was valid or not, but I thought that was something kind of an interesting approach to it. So the destination actually was moving around. Okay. And then we can kind of see what they did. They had, I'm not really sure what the metrics for this were. It was video traffic, some kind of video traffic. Okay. But we can see, pull out just a little bit so you guys can see these. Right. That's with regular TCP. So we see TCP employed in this kind of environment, that is not great. Okay. I mean, it's just constantly losing stuff. If you try and do that over a lossy network, that's pretty much what's going to happen. Okay. We see that regular UDP, okay, traffic being received was significantly higher. Okay, way higher. But here's the trick. With UDP and traffic being received, does that mean it was received in order? Does that mean it was received intact? No, it just means we got bits to the other side of the network. That's all that means. Doesn't mean it's usable, doesn't mean it's anything. It just means it got there. Okay. With RUDP, both with standard and enhanced, okay, significantly better performance out of that particular network. So they're talking about streaming data. That would be some kind of, probably drone footage or something like that. Okay, but significantly better performance. And as far as I know, RUDP is something that the Air Force actually uses. Okay. But kind of an interesting talk there, and that's something, again, I try not to get too far into the networking stuff just because you guys are still taking networking. But, okay, with regards to that discussion sheet, did I hit all of the points for RUDP, or is there something I did not go over? Do you guys have those discussion sheets? Did I get everything, or did I miss something? Okay, if I missed something, we'll come back. Now, this is something that is much more related to pervasive systems, okay? It's what's called gamification. And we've seen this kind of a lot in recent years, okay? We see it in pretty much every aspect of life at this point. It's surprising how people have integrated this into pretty much everything. What gamification is, basically it tries to use methods of game design to enrich what it calls non-gaming processes or non-gaming experiences. Okay? So basically, you take something you would use to make a video game interesting, and then you try to apply that to something in the real world. Okay? So it can be used for all sorts of different things, which is some of the things that we're going to talk about. Has been used for quite a while, especially for things like, education. Okay, I don't know if the Oregon Trail was educational necessarily, but that was probably in that category. And they've been doing things to try and make exercise and everything else, gamified for quite a while. So we're taking elements from video games and we're integrating them into real world things to try and make it a little bit more interesting. So why is this compelling? Okay. Basically, there are things that human beings, we naturally sort of need, okay? So what those things are, typically, we have things like socializing, learning, mastery, competition, achievement, status, altruism, and some kind of closure, okay? And so you can incorporate those into some kind of an activity. You will inherently make that a lot more compelling. Okay? So obviously you look at pretty much any kind of very popular video game and they have all of these things in here, right? World of Warcraft was really what made this the formula that it is today, okay? Which is we actually have people getting literally addicted to that kind of stuff, right? You guys have ever heard of Restart, right? That outpatient treatment facility for video game addicts. I mean, this is very real stuff. which that's an aside, but anyways. The biggest thing is, if we're going to attempt to apply this to the real world, what we want to do is we want to take small steps of progress, and we want to make them appear as if they are far more important than they actually are. So we can take what you're doing and break it down into little bitty pieces, okay, and then we can lay that progress out for people and make them see that progress. That is gonna make them a lot more motivated, because now it's not just this sort of abstract, amorphous thing that, yeah, I'm getting stuff done. Right, now I have proof that I'm getting stuff done. So especially things like, achievements, right? You got a Fitbit, it'll give you an achievement if you have so many steps per day or something like that. Right, progress bars, badges, all that kind of stuff. So if you can incorporate those into what you're doing, you can make that a lot more compelling. Okay. So, in some cases, okay, depending on what you're doing, you can actually have a lot of data that can go into this just kind of laying around. And you need to basically just have some sort of inventive way of showing that to people. Now, the trick is that when you're trying to come up with some kind of suitable gameplay mechanic, you really have to kind of target that specifically onto your domain, and you've got to be careful. Okay, so this can have some really tricky kind of ethical implications, right? For instance, if you are in something like a sales company has very, very definitive metrics for performance, right? How much are you pushing, what's worth each sale, and everything else, and they can really, really quantify that performance very, very closely. And so if you can attach some sort of gameplay element to those quantifications, that would be a really easy transition to make that into a game. But the trick is, if you make those quantifications that much more accessible, instead of motivating people to perform better, you could just start motivating people to stab each other in the back, right? Because if I can screw up all of your quantification metrics, it's gonna make mine look much better by comparison. So rather than motivating people to do better, you can actually motivating people to start screwing each other over, okay? Which is actually something you kind of have to be cognizant of in certain environments. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more of the ethical implications when we get to that section. Okay. So, again, where does this whole thing come around? It's obviously been in education forever. There are all sorts of different ways we can try and make learning, fun. Okay, so that is not necessarily anything new. Healthcare has also been something that has been used very successfully in the past. Okay, so there's a specific example here. Basically, the example that they had here was that when children were attempting to go through chemotherapy, they wanted a way to educate children as to what exactly that medication was doing to them. Right? And so they developed this video game, basically, which was a shooter video game, which is where children were going around and actively trying to fight against virtual tumor cells. And that was hopefully helping to educate them as to what the medication was supposed to be doing on their behalf. Okay, we have also seen a number of things. For instance, I've seen some work done in psychology when they had children and even really adults that were going to burn clinics to have recuperative work done on burn wounds. If they could put them into kind of a VR headset and put that VR headset into some environment that appeared to be very cold, like navigating a glacier or something like that, they had very tangible impacts on a person's pain perception, right? Because burns are obviously horribly, horribly painful, but if you immerse them into some environment where they feel cold, that can have a very tangible impact on their perception of pain, right? And so that was something that could be used for some really interesting things. So the idea was, well, if we can take some of these things and start doing them to encourage people to work harder, potentially we could have some impacts on productivity. So this kind of goes back to the gamification aspect. It was kind of an interesting idea. They had an Xbox Connect, and so they went into this senior living facility. And in senior living facilities, a lot of times they'd like you to do some really basic calisthenics to maintain things like balance and flexibility and everything else. But the trouble is, if you just have people standing up and around and doing these kind of yoga exercises or whatever, that's not very entertaining, especially if you're not very good at it. Okay, so what they did was they developed this system, and so by standing there and going through these exercises to improve your balance, basically if you could follow this around, it would be like you were flying a plane. So now you've got your hands out here, you're doing this kind of thing, and you're working on your equilibrium and everything else, but instead of just going through the exercise, now you're controlling an aircraft. Okay, something that can make that experience a lot more entertaining than just standing there and trying not to fall down. Okay, so, in the production industry, okay, so, again, a lot of these metrics are out there, and it's something that we really already have a grasp of. Okay, so again, management has been working about ways to kind of quantify an employee's productivity for as long as business has been a thing. Okay, and so the issue with this and some of the problem was, well, again, we have some ethical considerations. Okay, so if we have situations where, okay, well, we're quantifying an employee's performance and that employee is not doing very well, instead of attempting to motivate that employee to do better, we're just gonna fire them and get a better employee. Okay, which is perhaps not the most ethical thing you would want to facilitate, but however, you know, business is business, right? So, excuse me. Something else that they are attempting to integrate this into, and I'll zoom out a little bit so you guys can see this, is in things like production jobs, okay? So production jobs, one of the things that kind of lends them to being gamified, and I'll blow that up so you guys can see it just a little bit better. A lot of production jobs are very, very repetitive, right? So you're just kind of sitting there, especially if you're having to do stuff by hand, not very interesting, okay? However, because it is repetitive and because it can be quantified, here's how many units you are putting together per hour, here's how close you're doing, here's how many mistakes you're making, everything else, all that stuff's quantifiable. Right? So what they've done here, and I'll turn this all the way down so you guys can hopefully see those colors a little bit better. So what's happening here, this is on a pyramid, okay? And so he has all of the parts that he is assembling, okay, are all going to be in front of him, so he's taking those parts, and basically as he assembles some of those components, what happens is this person is shown ascending this series of rectangles here to get to the top of it. If he is on track and he's on time and he's not making a lot of mistakes, that particular level that he reaches is going to end up being green. Okay. If he gets behind in schedule, that can kind of turn colors. It will end up being orange if he's behind, or if he's making a certain number of mistakes per hour, that will turn into a different color. And the whole idea is that eventually, if we can monitor what's going on closely enough, this person will navigate to the top of the pyramid, everything will be nice and green, and he'll eventually get some kind of a trophy, right? Some kind of an achievement when he's done doing this. Okay, not the most elegant experience in the world, but you know, if you're going from this kind of a situation where it's like, okay, are you done? Well, hit the button, right? If you're done, you're doing something that is at least a little bit more interactive, right? A little bit more human-computer interaction. Okay. So again, not earth-shattering, but just something was trying to make a repetitive task a little bit more interesting. Okay, couple of issues with this. If you start going into these kind of environments, the reason people prefer to have these really simple displays here, it doesn't distract people. You don't want what's motivating them to be so compelling that they're not paying attention to what they're supposed to be doing. It's distracting. And you also have issues of safety. Okay, so what they're doing is distracting you. You're working with physical components. Well, now you can actually make it. Okay, so how can we kind of integrate this into an environment where it motivates people, but it's not really drawing their attention to the point where it becomes a hazard or a distraction or something like that? Always kind of a balance that you have to have. Okay, so again, just kind of a pervasive system sort of thing, something you can kind of look at. But in some of the papers that you guys are going to see, you can see aspects of this, okay? Things regarding to how can we use technology to motivate people to keep people healthier, especially lots and lots of work out there about health, okay? Monitoring health, trying to improve health, getting people active, okay? That kind of thing. All right, guys, so with regards to the discussion paper on there, did I hit everything that was on that discussion sheet? Did I miss anything? Okay, any questions on this stuff? Not it. Okay, are you guys at least looking at your papers at this point, finding stuff that's interesting? Okay, I haven't looked at the Blackboard form in a while. Okay, Again, guys, if you're picking out a paper and you get something that's really boring, or it's just way over your head or something, just pick something else. Right? You know, don't get stuck reading something that you don't get or is not at all in. Yeah.
So will we reply to like the original post we had on there, like saying that we updated to like this paper?
Yeah, you can do that. You can just have a new post on there.
Okay.
As long as I can track what's going on. You're
Okay.
fine. Okay. Other questions? I got access point should be up and running. If you got questions on your lab,